Welcome to the Informed Simplicity Project, where we're taking a shared journey to learn more about our bodies from a polyvagal perspective. I'm Dr. Jordan Harris, and I'm here with our guide, our polyvagal guide, Dr. Julia Conroy. And this is our series on how stress impacts our bodies. Let's recap. We're looking at how stress impacts our emotional and physical health from a polyvagal perspective. The idea is that our bodies have three general responses. Our first response when faced with challenge is to use our relationships to co-regulate. This is called our social engagement response. When not in challenge, we use our social engagement system to enjoy being with others. This is the system that helps us emotionally to feel close and connected, and then physically to help to grow and to heal. But sometimes we are threatened, and this is when we go into fight or flight. This is when we have experiences like we get irritable, angry, aggressive, or we get anxious, nervous, and want to run away. And if we get signals that our life is in danger, right, that our threat response is going to be overwhelmed, we go into freeze. But freeze isn't only about freezing. It's also about going numb, dissociating, fainting, and generally shutting down. And that is polyvagal theory in a brief overview. And today we're applying polyvagal theory to attachment. This is Sapolsky's chapter on stress and mothers. I love the name of this chapter. Dwarfism and the importance of mothers.
That's right. It really gets down to it.
It really gets down to it. So Dr. Conroy, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, because what we're really doing through Sapolsky's lens here is kind of trying to understand that second response that Jordan described with more clarity, right? That fight or flight response is really Sapolsky's focus, is what happens when the body senses that threat and is trying to adjust and adapt. And so that's really what he's looking at here. And as he's talking about mothers, as he's talking about dwarfism in it, he initially starts just kind of talking about appreciating the complexity of how we grow as people. Obviously, maybe for those of us that are parents or expecting parents or have just been around a child, we know that this is, a really fast process in some ways and a really slow process in others. Of course, like the brain getting bigger, the cell division that requires, the proteins that are synthesized, the bones that grow, all of the organs that grow, the baby fat that kind of sheds eventually and gets replaced by muscle. This is all a big process of growth. And again, Sapolsky's point consistently is typical human functioning requires a lot of the body. And so it's easy to miss. It's easy to not appreciate the complexity of it, but he really breaks that down to help us appreciate all the growth hormones are doing in order to get that body to the next stage of development. So that's breaking down fat stores so that they can be converted into growing cells. It's looking to kind of activate the thyroid hormone, which allows our bones to grow in the way that they're meant to, the reproductive hormones that come into play around puberty. All of this is happening. And again, it's easy to miss because it's not conscious. This is just what our bodies do. But I don't need to tell any parent of an adolescent or any parent of a toddler that's in the midst of a big growth spurt, appetites change, that the body is needing more in that phase. It's requiring more energy because it takes a lot for the body to grow in the way that it does, for brains to develop and get everything that they're meant to, for the muscles, for the bones to get everything that they're meant to get. So it's appreciating the complexity that goes into just typical development that we see from most children. But with all that goes into that, all the hormones, all of the fat stores that get broken down, all the energy that's converted. Again, because this process is so complex, because it's so layered, that again opens up a lot of room for when there is stress present for that process to be interrupted. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today, is the way that that growth process can get interrupted.
I love that you said that. Even as you're talking, it just really struck me, right? Like the attachment process is linked inherently to the growth process. And we don't necessarily mean like my emotional growth. We mean like physically growing from a child into a teenager to an adult. And I think you see this when, you know, a lot of the, so he talks in the book about prenatal stress, right? And so how stress, even before we're born, impacts how we grow after we're born. And then he talks, so that's sort of like the first part of the book, right? And then he talks in the book about, well, we should even touch on this, but how like after you're born, when you're a child or a toddler, stress impacts your body's ability to physically grow. And if there's a lot of stress and not a lot of caregiver support, you end up with things like failure to thrive, right? Where babies literally do not grow. And then it even goes into like young childhood, right? Talking about, okay, we know that people who are in emotionally connected environments, like physically grow, and those who are in really abusive, negative environments, like don't grow, right? And so as you're saying that, I'm like, oh yeah, you know, a huge part of stress is literally on, do your bones lengthen when they're supposed to, right? Like, oh yeah, that's crazy. Our bodies are that fine-tuned to stress. Wow.
It is. And I always feel like this is a really important disclaimer. Anytime we're talking about attachment, anytime that we're talking about child development, specifically for parents that might be listening, because I think that this can be a really sensitive topic of, okay, if my child is only in, you know, the 14th percentile, right, for where they should be, does that mean I've been stressful? Does that mean all of these things, right? And it can really open the door for shame to set in around what causes might be present and what might have to be a contributing factor, right, for my child's development. And that's a scary place to be. And so I just want to acknowledge, for parents that might be listening and might be kind of assessing where their child is, I want to recognize all children will experience stress, right? And that's okay. In fact, it's actually a very good thing that your child experiences stress in your home, right? And if this worries you, that, okay, have they experienced too much stress? Is that a result of it? The answer is probably no. If you have that degree of empathy, if you have that level of concern, if you're caring for your child in these ways, then it's likely that they're in a safe home where they know that their needs are met. And a lot of the stress that we're talking about here that can have such devastating consequences is not, I have thrown tantrums 6 days in a row, but it's more, I don't know where my next meal is coming from. I don't know, unfortunately, pretty severe cases of abuse and neglect, that it's really that degree of stress that we're going to be referring to that has this impact on growth and development. And so I just think that that's really important to include. I don't want to set off any unnecessary panic alarms. If you're listening to this as a parent, you're probably pretty emotionally attuned with your child. But it's really just kind of appreciating the impact that stress can have on growth and development but understanding that within reason, we're talking about really severe stress that impairs growth.
Yes. I think that's such a necessary sort of disclaimer and also acknowledgement, right? Because we're talking about the connection between parenting and growth, we don't want parents to walk away from this feeling shamed. Most of the time in these examples that we're going to give, it's extreme cases of neglect and abuse. And the chances are, if you're listening to this, that's probably not your situation, right? And then I think the other side of that is, if you do struggle, right? Because of polyvagal theory, we know that it's not your destiny. So things can change. So there's also hope. And I think that that's such an important thing to say, because parenting is a very personal thing. It's very personal. It's tied into your hopes for your future, for your kids' future, tied into the past with you and your own parents. Like there's a lot of weight, right? I mean, parenting changes your identity, like almost nothing else does. So there's a lot of weight, and we want to respect that and say, okay, we're going to talk about this, but also know that this probably doesn't apply to you, and it doesn't mean that you're a bad person or a bad parent. Yeah, I love that. So let's talk about prenatal stress and the Dutch winter hunger, this is one of my favorite stories.
When you say it's one of your favorite stories, I just get like so worried for your kids. They're gonna think like the Dutch hunger story is like equivalent to like, you know, Little Red Riding Hood. That's what every child's hearing.
I mean, they're both Dutch, right? So obviously, obviously. Yeah, I mean, full disclosure, this is the way that I, harm my kids. I just tell them science stories every night, and they're like, Dad, stop.
We've all got some way we're doing it.
Yeah. Do you want me to, why don't you sort of just give a brief overview of the Dutch winter hunger?
I'm honored that you would have me summarize one of your favorite stories. Can I start with that? And so basically what the Dutch winter hunger population ultimately shows us, if I can zoom out and give big picture, is that we actually saw that during this pretty extensive famine, that it wasn't just, the people that were living during this famine that were impacted, and not just their children that were impacted. In addition to that, their grandchildren were also born with lower than expected birth rates or weights.
Yeah, so, birth weights, yeah.
And so with that, it kind of, I mean, it's definitely been talked about and kind of established in other ways, but so this was specifically, that's kind of what it shows us big picture. But this is like the story during World War II, occupying Nazis, where obviously we're trying to be pushed back, and the Dutch were trying to aid the Allies that were coming to liberate them. The Nazis cut off their food, and then obviously the Dutch people starve as that food is being cut off. So people during this time are consuming less than 1,000 calories a day, and we're eating things like tulip bulbs just to sustain life. And we saw over 16,000 people during this crisis that starved to death. And so obviously this is really severe impact. The level of stress that's present is huge there, but also what we see in those decreasing birth rates, weights 3 generations later, right, is that this isn't just directly impacting what's present in the slowed down metabolism at that time. Though, if you are a first trimester fetus during that famine, Of course, you're going to be at greater risk for all of those things because as your organs are forming, that's pretty impacted by that famine and that deprivation. But we also see this taking place not only in the people impacted, their children, but their children, which
Yeah.
shows that stress, again, this is extreme stress to this degree, is coded within the genes that are passed on.
Yeah.
And we kind of see the ripples of that effect.
I really like how Sapolsky sort of frames this too, right? He says, what is childhood about? It's a time when you make assessments about the nature of the world, which is totally an attachment statement. And basically what he's saying is, because the Dutch during World War II were starved, and we're going through the loss of so many of their friends and family members, all of these moms who were having kids, all these pregnant women, they were very, very stressed, right? And so when their babies were born, they had all these metabolic issues. And one of the sort of outcomes of that was they had lower birth weights, because their bodies are basically primed to say, okay, the world that I'm going into has less resources. So my body needs to conserve as much as possible, right? And because their metabolism sort of set up that way, when they then go on to have kids, and those kids of that World War II generation go on to have kids, their bodies are still sort of like collecting all these resources, which means that they give their babies less resources, which means that those kids, the third generation out, are still impacted by this thing. And I think it's one of my favorite stories because of how long lasting this trauma is, right? On a physiological level. It's not just the mentality of it. It's not just the cognitions and the thoughts that go along with that. It's like, man, physically, this is impacting people's bodies for multiple generations.
Absolutely.
It's just shows the depth that sometimes trauma can have on people for generations.
Absolutely. And I think that I'd be foolish not to include with that too, that we don't just see this with regard to starvation, but there's actually a lot of research being done right now of kind of establishing the effect that this even has racially, and the racial stress that was so present, right? And even if overt racism isn't as present as it was in the 60s, right? That doesn't change the fact that the severe degree of stress that generation did experience was passed on not only to their children through socialization, but also through their genes, right? And not only that, but that's passed on to their grandchildren as well, where maybe it looks different right now, and yet that trauma is still encoded in such a big way. And was having a conversation with a colleague of ours, Dr. James Hawkins, who's a phenomenal clinician. And he was talking about, like, I have to appreciate this context as a Black man. I'm not just holding my own trauma, right? But generationally and genetically, I know that past trauma has also been stored within me, and I carry the weight of that too. So also just want to appreciate the complexity with which that trauma is passed on, that it doesn't just extend, to physiological starvation, but just this consistent fear and pressure and just concern too for loved ones, and that all of that stress that is so severe and feels life-threatening, all of that is encoded and then passed on as well.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not just about the things that are happened to you and to your ancestors, right? It's also about the ways that comes out now. And so, yeah, one of the big ways with the Dutch winter hunger kids is that they had lower birth weights, right? And were more likely to be like obese and have metabolic issues. But they also had higher rates of things like anxiety and depression.
Yeah.
And so the same thing is happening now, right? The children of the 60s, especially people like me who are, you know, African American and sort of holding that trauma, like a lot of us have higher rates of anxiety and depression,
Mhm.
you know, that's been sort of that's the unfortunate legacy of the things that our grandparents and our parents had to face every day.
Mhm. Absolutely.
You know?
And also wanting to recognize, like, as a white woman, my racial trauma looks like being insensitive, right? And being unaware and choosing to be ignorant to the plight of my Black brothers and sisters and all people of color, right? And that's what my trauma looks like, is just that ignorance, right? And that shifts even the way that gene is expressed in me and my ability to be empathic in that sense. And so being aware of the way that this is passed on through the genes and is established before we leave the womb, this has been encoded on us and is a part of us, helps us to be aware of the ways that trauma translates from generation to generation, just so we can appreciate the fullness of, yes, my experience, but also the experience of those around me that I might not be able to fully take in because I can only see what's right in front of me.
Yeah. I think that's really important. I don't like how you said that, because you do. You want to take in the full person when you're sitting
Mhm.
with them. And some of that's obvious, right?
Mhm.
And some of that's not obvious. And I think we don't necessarily have to know what's not obvious, because
Mhm.
it's not obvious.
Yeah,
But we do need to be aware of the fact that there is more going on there than we realize.
yeah.
There's more going on there than is first present to us.
Absolutely, especially as we're appreciating this idea of growth and development, right? And what Zapolsky does so great in this chapter is just help us to appreciate before you leave the womb, right? If there have been severe levels of stress that's impacted, and that also, he uses this term fetal origins of adult disease, that if there have been strong degrees of stress present, that actually increases your propensity for diseases later in life. So things like obesity, hypertension, cardiovascular disease, insulin resistant form of diabetes, reproductive impairments, impaired brain development, all of this, right, that can have an effect on later functioning in life, is a part of that prenatal stress result.
Yeah.
And so Zapolsky doesn't just leave us there, aware of all the things that can go wrong before a child leaves the womb. But like you said, he kind of charts through these different levels of development, and kind of the effect that stress can have on lifelong development and what that looks like.
Yeah, right. Because then he goes into postnatal stress.
Right.
And I think we should probably give a brief overview of attachment here, right? And so just so people have a little bit of a context in which to like understand, I think the next few chapters, the next few
Mhm.
sections. So attachment is this idea sort of coined by John Bowlby, who again was a psychotherapist during World War II. And what he saw was all of these orphans of World War II, all these kids who were sort of not just orphaned, but also abandoned when their parents went off to fight in the war or joined the war effort, had huge rates of delinquency, depression, and other issues. And he'd been looking at the research, the cross species research, and he had looked at how, like, young ducks will imprint on a parent,
Mhm.
follow that parent around. And he said something similar happens to young kids, that when it that they need that person to imprint on, to attach
Mhm.
to follow around. And when that doesn't happen, they wind up like the kids that I'm seeing, the kids with depression
Mhm.
and anxiety and delinquency issues. And this was sort of his big theory, but the person who really put it on the map, who sort of made it actionable, was a lady named Mary Ainsworth.
Mhm.
And she's huge because what she did was she took the theory and she developed a way to test it.
Mm.
And so basically what she did was she took kids with their parents, typically a mom, and she put them in a room. She observed them playing, and she had the mom leave, and a stranger would come in. And kids would, well, and then the parent would come back in, right? And she called this experiment the strange situation, right? And basically what she was watching is, how do these kids respond to their parents when their parents come back into the room?
Mhm.
And she found basically at first glance was people respond in these kids respond in one of three ways, right? Some kids, when the parent comes back into the room, they run to the parent. They're like so happy that the parent is back, and then they are okay. They go back to playing, right? Some kids, the parents come in the room, the kid looks at the parent and goes back to playing. And then the last group of kids in her original sort of experiment, they see the parent, they run to the parent, and they're inconsolable. They never really calm down. And what she discovered by following these kids over time was the first group, the kids who looked at the parent, ran to them, hugged them, greeted them, and went back to playing. Those were kids who had positive outcomes long term. So she called these kids securely attached. They can securely depend on their caregiver in a new, strange situation. The second group of kids, when she looked at their parent and then went back, were the kids who everyone thought was fine. But what she actually found out was that underneath the surface, they were not okay, right?
Mhm.
Even though the kids appeared to keep going back to playing long term, they had all sorts of problems. And when they checked the kids in the moment, these kids had like higher heart rates, right? They were internally, their bodies were saying, this is a strange situation. A stranger's here. I don't know what's going on. And these are the kids that they labeled avoidant, right? They avoided their attachment figure. They avoided their needs for connection to someone else. And then the third group of kids, the ones who ran to the parents and couldn't be consoled, these kids were obviously anxious. And long term, they also had poor health and mental health outcomes. And so from this, they learned that what kids need to be successful long term is an attachment that is secure to a older, typically an older, wiser other, right? So that's sort of like the basic history of like, you know, human attachment that we've studied in the field. So yeah, I would love to then to get into
Absolutely.
some of this stuff about these kids who were in these orphans, but if you want to give a few thoughts on
Oh, yes. I think that's a beautiful review of attachment. And I think I can talk about attachment all day, so I'll be really careful not to. But I think what I ultimately, the maybe misconception I hear most about attachment is, okay, that means that we have to be together all the time. It means like it's like kind of used with like codependent a lot, maybe that idea. And so I think that the place that I got most clear on secure attachment is it means I know that I have a secure base to return to. Like I know when things get crazy, this is kind of a safe place, a safe relationship I can go back to. And that doesn't make me cling to that really tightly, but when it's securely attached, it means I can explore. It means I can try new things. It means I can do something I've never done before because I know when it hits the fan, I've got a safe place to go back to and the world's not going to crumble. I think that was really huge for me. And I think even interpreting that through a polyvagal lens, what that's kind of saying is we're not looking for a place where you're never stressed and never activated. right? But you have some surety in the ways you can activate your social engagement system when you are stressed, that I can reach out for someone, that I can look for that comfort in those moments. Um, and that secure attachment is such a big piece when we're talking about growth and development in the body's response to stress, because basically Zapolsky goes through all these different studies on rats and on people and everything in between, that basically show that just getting your physiological needs is not going to be enough to thrive. And so
So
there were a few.
let
Go
me
ahead.
jump in here, because something that you said a while ago to me really sort of brought this home. And I had never heard it this way. And I was like, how did I miss that for a decade? Because we were talking about parenting and my youngest, and my youngest has this habit, right, of playing with my oldest and falling down and getting hurt, and he'll run to me. And I was talking to you about this. I don't even know if this was on a podcast, but maybe it was just outside of this. And he always runs to me, right? And he'll just lay his head on my shoulder, and I'll hold him for a minute or two, right? And then he'll go back to what he's doing, right?
Mhm.
And I'd be like, why does this kid not learn? And you said something, and I wish I could say it the way that you said it, because it was so elegant, but it was like, that's secure attachment. Because he knows he can go to you, he then has the courage to go and get knocked down again,
Mhm.
right? Like, because he knows he can go to you, that's why he will go back and try to jump off the couch again, right? Whatever it is, he's not afraid to do that anymore, because he has the
Mhm.
security of, I can always go back here. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's a beautiful picture.
Mhm.
And I think we need to paint that picture very clearly. And I appreciate you for doing that, because our fear for a lot of us in this idea of attachment or codependency is, if I have that person, I'll never leave.
Mhm.
And so what we think of as healthy is the person who's avoidant. I don't need my mom, I can keep playing. But what we know actually is, um, if you are secure in that relationship, that is what allows you to go off and do all the other fun exploratory things.
Absolutely, because it's annoying when it's falling off the couch. It's just like, quit playing on the couch,
Right.
right? But when you think about years down the road, let's say, I think the world of Jordan's kids, that will become clearly apparent if we keep talking about that. But let's say one day Julian is a coder, right? And he's like developing all this new code, and he keeps hitting these blocks, right? Where it's like, I just can't figure this out. Well, as a parent, right, how encouraging would it be just when he fails miserably, right? Just to come back to you and just say, Dad, this sucks. I cannot figure this out, right? And just for you to co-regulate in that moment and be like, that is so hard. You're giving it your best. That makes so much sense, right? Him returning to you allows him to go and enter that space and to try again with that code differently, right? And from a sustained and regulated place. Whereas if that secure attachment isn't present, he's going to burn himself out, because his whole sense of worth, right, is dependent on him doing this, right? And he's going to hate it by the end of it, right? Or it's like, this is too hard. I hate how this makes me feel about myself. I don't want to code ever again, right? That this is such a beautiful thing when it's seen later in life, when you're able to regulate in this capacity. And seeing the building blocks of that now is so, so important, because it translates in much bigger ways later.
Yeah, I agree. All right, let's go into this next section, Jules.
Okay, I really wanted to touch on this one study just because I found it so interesting, and then we can keep moving. But as Zapolsky just gives us all these examples of how important attachment is, how having physiological needs met can't be it. He references specifically this experiment, which, my gosh, I hope it wasn't like sanctioned, because this is awful, of two different orphanages in Germany after World War II took place. So both of these orphanages were run by the government, and they did set controls in place, meaning the kids had the same diet, the same frequency of doctor's visits, they were given the same physiological care and access to resources and all those things. The primary difference that was set in place between these orphanages was the primary caretaker. One of them being a warm, nurturing mother figure who played with the children, who comforted them, who sang with them and laughed with them. The other was more focused on kind of the professional aspects, minimized contact, was seen that her disciplinary approach was more focused on like public criticism and berating in front of their peers. And what these found is that the growth rates of the kids in these two orphanages were significantly different. The one that were raised in that harsher environment where they're not given as much contact, not allowed as much room to play, and these bonding experiences with their caretaker were significantly shorter and were significantly underweight and grew at a significantly slower pace than the kids in the other orphanage. And it even says to the point where at some point the caretakers are, transition out. And then what we
They're like
find
swapped,
is
aren't they? I think they're like
not,
swapped or something. Or
yeah, they said not swapped because I think one like retired, the sweet nurturing
oh, the
one
sweet
like
one retired.
retired.
That's right.
Yes.
And the critical
And
one moves to the one where everyone was happy.
well, and we see that growth rates actually increase after kind of that harsher one leaves, that their growth rates increase significantly after she goes.
Yeah.
Right. And presumably a more nurturing figure was placed in. But then also after the nurturing figures leaves the first orphanage, that their growth rates actually slow. And so, my gosh, this is terrifying that this was brought into awareness and all these things. It's kind of a disturbing example. But it does point something to the impact that this attachment and that these bonding co-regulatory experiences act, basically all the things that the first caretaker did to activate the social engagement system allowed for them, right, to grow at a more typical rate, because all of these children have experienced trauma, right? They're all living in orphanages in post-World War II Germany. There's no way that there's not trauma present, right? But just seeing the difference that caretaker can make, I think was really interesting. Pointed out in a ton of different studies in this, but that was kind of one that stood out to me.
Yeah, right. I think that for me, in the book, he has a chart, so you can see it, right? Like when the critical caregiver goes to sort of the happy orphanage, you see the happy orphanage kids stop growing, and you see the kids who are at, her original site start growing. Like you can see like the hockey stick, and it's like, these poor kids, these poor kids. It makes me think about my own. I remember I had a teacher in high school. I'll never forget her. Never forget her. And every Monday we would go in, and she'd say, "Good morning." We'd say, "Good morning, Miss Morgan." And she'd say, "I love you." And we'd say, "Love you, Miss Morgan." We were all in high school, right? She was my favorite teacher. And just because she was that warm, like comforting presence. And she was very strict. She was very strict, had very firm boundaries. But whenever I was talking to her, I always felt like this woman cares. And that sort of energy is what we're sort of talking about, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I find that the people in my life that most embody that didn't let me get away with everything I want, right? The coaches that I think of, the teachers that I think of didn't just let me run wild, right? But I knew that they cared. And I knew that when I really needed something, I could reach out, that they were a safe base for me to return to.
Yeah.
So not only does that stand out in our memories, not only does that give us the warm fuzzies as we think about that person, but Zapolsky, the research that he lays out here says it also allows for typical development, forming those connections, forming those bonds, promotes the typical development processes that we see in children.
Yeah. And I think that's sort of the thing that I hope we're in sort of this transition period, right? Like if you look at the history of this, at the beginning of the 1900s, parents weren't even allowed into hospitals to see their kids, right? And orphanages and homes for kids were very, very strict and rule-based, right? And there was a sort of cultural narrative of, we don't want to make kids weak by giving them too much support.
Mhm.
And what we've seen for all of those kids is that they have issues like this, right? Where they don't grow, they have higher rates of delinquency, higher rates of anxiety and depression. And the crazy thing is, they also had higher rates of infection and disease, right? Because their bodies were not in a state to take care of itself. Their bodies were having a chronic, prolonged stressor because they had the lack of that attachment figure there. And it actually made health outcomes worse. And it's just sort of like, wow, like this thing is really, really important. So
Absolutely. And Zapolsky touches in the book on the research that shows why this is, especially as it pertains to growth, because the growth hormone that's secreted in the body and says, all right, let's get moving, like let's get things expanding here. It's actually secreted by the pituitary gland, which is regulated by the hypothalamus. So again, we've talked a lot in this series about the body's response to stress, but just as a refresher, when the body experiences severe levels of stress, it says stop to everything non-essential and let's prioritize everything that's going to mobilize us and promote survival right now in this moment with the stress that's present. So it presses pause on the secretion of that hormonal release, meaning the growth hormone isn't present in the bloodstream as long as that stress response is there. And it's not, and I think the thing is that we're talking about with this idea of attachment is that what we see in the social engagement system through the polyvagal lens, because the social engagement system, because that secure bond allows me to regulate myself and takes me out of that fight or flight response. That means that things are geared up again and that growth hormone can be secreted the way that it's meant to. And so overactivity of that sympathetic nervous system, like sustained stress responses, like we've talked about before, inhibits that hormone from even being released. In the most severe circumstances, we see this manifesting as stress dwarfism, which is really rare. It's not the type of stress of like, I've got traffic, someone's yelling at me. This is seen in really, really severe cases of abuse and neglect. And maybe we can all see in our mind some story, like tragic, truly story that we've seen on the news where kids have been confined to a house or confined to a room for a sustained period of time. And there's so many issues that stem from that. But one of that is typically we see them to be smaller in stature, to be lower in body weight. A lot of times it's because food has been restricted, but we also see this component of, because they're in such high degrees of life-threatening stress for such sustained and critical periods of growth, we see that stunting that in a lifelong capacity just because that growth hormone can't be secreted in the same way.
yeah. I love that you said that, right? Because we're not talking about normal everyday stress.
Mhm.
We're not talking about even like a one-off sort of acute trauma, right?
Mhm.
Being in Hurricane Katrina,
Mhm.
being in Vietnam.
Mhm.
We're talking about sustained terror when
Mhm.
you're at your most vulnerable. Yeah. Um, do you want to talk? I know you're like best friends with Bruce Perry. Do you want to just give a brief overview of some of the stuff that he's found? Maybe I shouldn't say
I am.
best friends, but I feel like you and
I
him are just like
very
buddies.
much appreciate Bruce Perry's work. He and Rick Gaskell have done some incredible work of just talking about kind of this idea and developing um,
His
the
neurosequential model, right?
neurosequential model of therapeutics, right? Which is basically saying, okay, because these processes get stunted, these growth processes and brain development processes, that all of this gets stunted early in life because of the severe stress response. Basically, their findings indicate you have to hit those milestones before and kind of establish that foundation before you can build higher order processes. So a lot of their early, and I'm not certified or anything like that, but have just looked into the research that basically says, okay, first we just try to do really basic calming techniques that most infants receive. That our therapeutic process looks like rocking, and it looks like finding a rhythm, and it looks like kind of hitting these milestones that should have been hit much earlier in life, knowing that if we don't establish that foundation, we have nothing to build on. Even if I'm seeing a child for the first time, 7, 8 years old, but they never experienced that due to that severe abuse or neglect, I have to start there. I have to start with those infant processes and then build up according to that neurodevelopmental model to kind of, with the hopes of eventually catching them up to speed, but not being able to introduce them to the therapeutic process that a typical 7-year-old would be able to benefit from.
Which is, I think, very polyvagal, right? In a sense,
Mhm.
because part of what polyvagal says is it's our body's felt sense that we have to sort of have first,
Yeah.
that then allows us to do higher order things, right? So even
Mhm.
Porges would say, like, the most important thing in talk therapy is how safe and comfortable you feel with the therapist, not the words that are
Absolutely.
being said. And
Mhm.
he would even say, like, things that are really important for kids to get are things like play. Like, that has
Mhm.
to happen first before they
Mhm.
can really do sort of the higher order things like thinking through their decisions.
Yeah.
So I think that's all sort of aligned. Doesn't Perry have
Mhm.
some sort of stat like severe neglect or trauma in the first 3 months shows up just as bad or worse than like from 3 months to like 12 years, something like that.
Yeah. I'm
I
not
don't
sure if
know.
I've heard that statistic, but I believe you.
Yeah. But it's basically like this idea that like when you're at your most vulnerable in those first
Mhm.
three months, if you get traumatized then, if you have severe
Mhm.
neglect and trauma then,
Mhm.
that's a huge predictor for outcomes later on. So
Yeah.
it's sort of the same idea of like parallel to when this stuff happens to you,
Mhm.
it's also a big indicator of how it impacts you.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Um, so then we talk about hospitals
Mhm.
and touch.
Mhm.
Can you sort of give us a brief overview of touch and how that makes a big difference here?
Yeah, absolutely. And so basically the overview um, that Zapolsky goes into is just talking about, and again, this has huge, I think, polyvagal implications as well, right? That you had referenced at one point, parents aren't able to come in to the hospital with their child, but actually what we see um, is that this level of affection and closeness, right? This degree of touch through a polyvagal lens, we would think activates that social engagement system, right, which we know decreases that stress response and allows for that immune functioning that has been suppressed in that activation, to promote better rates of healing, to promote increased immunity. Because I have this social engagement activated, my body can prioritize on fighting not what it perceives to be an immediate stressor or fear, right? That's so clearly a part of the hospital experience, but can really prioritize the immunity that's necessary in the healing process that's necessary for why I'm in the hospital in the first place.
I think for me, this was one of the most polyvagal part of this whole book, right? Because Sapolsky is really saying, okay, we know that this happens, that if you have a secure person that you can go to, if you have a relationship that you can go to, that you are healthier. But what's the pathway for this? And he basically says, yeah, touch, right? Touch is a big thing. And I think on the one hand, that's very polyvagally informed, right? And on the other hand, it's like the thing that makes touch safe is if you have the safe relationship, right? If a weirdo comes into my room when I'm in the hospital, says, let me hold your hand, I'm gonna be like, I don't know you. Like, that's not the same thing. But if my wife comes in and holds my hand, that's when my body can go, okay, I can make it through this. I can heal, I can grow, I can restore. I think the only other thing, and I know we're coming up to our time here, is when I first read this stuff and was studying a bunch of this stuff, I felt kind of confused about the difference between attachment and polyvagal. And after listening to Porges talk about this, he says polyvagal theory is the preamble to attachment, right? And part of what that means is we're looking at that the same thing, right? We're reading from the same book. But what polyvagal theory is really sort of tuning into is what are the cues of safety and how does the body respond? And so that's why things like having a melodic voice, you know, which is an inherent cue of safety, or taking longer out breaths, which is an inherent cue of turning off the sympathetic nervous system. Or if you're safe, you know, being able to touch someone are sort of polyvagal cues that we look for in relationships, right? And attachment is more about what's my internal model of the world and of my close people, right? So they're looking at the same thing, but just from a different perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And from a polyvagal perspective, it's like if you're so stuck and rigid in fight or flight, or you're dissociated, right, because your dorsal vagal complex has been activated, then what shot do you have, right, at social engagement and at secure attachment, right? And so they take kind of different perspectives and maybe put different language to that, but ultimately both are pointing to the healing power that relationships ultimately have in making us our most resilient and best functioning selves.
Yeah. Okay, Dr. Conroy, let's wrap it up here. What's your closing thought? What's your closing thought from this chapter?
I think closing thought here, I love talking about attachment. I love talking about the power that relationships have. And I think even as you talked about your teacher, I think the reason I love talking about it so much is it allows me to kind of pull on my own attachment longings, and the safe spaces I have and the ways that promotes growth even now in me, maybe less physically as a grown adult woman than it did in my childhood. But just, I think I'm kind of left appreciating thinking about my own safe spaces that I had growing up that allowed me to thrive the way that they did. Um, but also some sadness mixed with hope of that that's not the case for a lot of people I interact with. That's not the case for a lot of people that I care for. Um, and that's a very sad thing that that opportunity to thrive wasn't presented. But I think, like we keep referencing this hope, that also doesn't seal their fate um, for who they are. That especially through this polyvagal lens, it is so hopeful that they can find a new way of functioning and a new way of regulating. So I think that was kind of a blend and more of a personal reflection there.
Yeah. I think for me, my closing thought is the hope that I think is sort of embedded in this.
Mhm.
And I think that goes back to the Dutch winter hunger and the
Mm,
intergenerational transmission of like racial
mm,
trauma. It's like for those of us who are children of that, when we find safe and secure others, like healing can happen.
mm,
And so for me, it's also that hope, you know, that even when our bodies are primed one way, when we find those people and we can feel safe and secure, whether that's a friend or a therapist, um, then our bodies can return to this state of healing and growth.
mm,
And I think
mm,
for me, that's the beautiful, hopeful part of all this.
mm. I love that. That's powerful.
All right, Dr. Conroy, I'll see you next week.
That sounds good. I'll be here.